Hi, my name is Taylor, and I'm a psychotherapist for My Therapy NYC, a private group practice in the Flatiron neighborhood of Manhattan in New York City. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about grief in this webinar, sharing what grief is and how you might recognize it in yourself, and give some practical suggestions for how you might be able to manage feelings of grief as they come up. Before we jump in, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. We're going to be doing this webinar through Zoom, and so there are a couple features that I want to draw your attention to. So first is the poll question that should have popped up on your screen. It's a question about myths about grief, so feel free to answer it, and we will come back to the responses at a later point in the webinar. A couple other features to be aware of is first the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Through this chat box, you can share questions or reactions to the webinar that can be seen by all of the attendees. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, there is a little thing that you can toggle to either send a message to just the panelists or to the panelists and all of the attendees. So if you want your remarks to be seen by all the attendees of the webinar, then go ahead and just make that change so that you make sure that the message is going to the right place. There's also the chat box for the Q&A. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's going to be a little Q&A button, and that is what we'll use for answering questions at the end of the webinar related to what we'll be talking about tonight. So if you have any questions that as they come up, feel free to send those to us, and they will only be seen by myself and the people who are helping me to put on this webinar tonight. So without further ado, let's jump right in. I'm going to be sharing my screen so that you can see a PowerPoint slide that I have prepared along with this presentation. So the title of tonight's webinar is Good Mourning, How to Move Through the Grieving Process. As I have already said, I'm going to be talking about grief and provide some practical suggestions for how to manage feelings of grief as they arise. Alrighty, so what is grief? So grief is the normal process of reacting to a loss. The example that I often will give my clients is if you think about losing your keys, you might be patting your pockets and seeing, okay, the keys aren't there anymore, right? And immediately your heart might start racing. You're starting to think, okay, where did I leave my keys? And that reaction can be considered a grief response because there's something that you've lost and you're trying to emotionally make sense of what has happened. In addition to grief, there's mourning, which is the process by which one adapts to a loss. So again, with the key example, you have lost your keys, you're having that strong reaction, and the mourning response is what you do in reaction to that grief. So you may be looking around your house, taking a look under the couch cushions, starting to think about, okay, well, I don't have my keys. What kind of impact does this have on my life? And you're starting to make plans for how you're going to get into your apartment or how you're going to get into your office at work if you don't have your keys. And that is oftentimes what the mourning process will look like. It is a process of adapting to a life without the person, thing, or experience that you are now missing out on. So I'm going to hop back to, I'm going to hop back to the poll. We're going to jump in and take a look at the different responses. So it looks like the most common thing that you might have heard about grief is that time heals all wounds. That is a super common phrase that we often throw about, especially as we're talking about the loss of a loved one. It really hurts to lose somebody, and sometimes there's the assumption that over time it gets easier. While that can certainly be the case, that doesn't necessarily mean that the grief is gone. It's just changed shape. And so I'll be talking about some of these other let's hop over to this slide now to talk about some of these other myths that were responded to. Another really common one was that grief should only last a year. A common myth that I hear in my practice is that grief has or should have an end point. That, okay, it's been a year since the person died or since you lost your job, you should be over it, right? What research has shown and what clinical practice has demonstrated is that that is not necessarily the case. That you may end up grieving somebody or something that you've lost forever. Another common myth that I hear is that if you're still doing something, if you're still crying, if you're still visiting the grave of the person that you've lost, that means that you are somehow stuck. We'll be talking a little bit later about models of grief response, and I think that that's the idea of a model of grief following a logical step has gotten it into our heads that if we are doing one particular step of the grieving process for too long, that somehow you're stuck in your grief. Another myth that I often hear is that you can or should only grieve death, particularly the death of a family member or friend. There are lots of things that we can grieve over, and we'll be talking in a second about a wide range of things that you can have a grief and mourning response to. Something that I hear from religious clients is that if you're grieving, that you don't have enough faith. That if you're experiencing grief, that you don't have enough faith in a higher power to take care of you or to take care of the bad situation that you may find yourself in as a result of the loss. Spirituality or a belief in a higher power and the grief response are not mutually exclusive. You can grieve and still have a strong belief in a religious or spiritual framework. Another thing that I'll be showing a video on later is a myth that the goal of grief is to move on. We often think that, okay, you are done with the grieving process when it no longer hurts and when you can put the loss behind you. Again, what we find in research and clinical practice is that grief is something that lasts oftentimes forever. It just changes shape, it changes form into something that feels a little bit more manageable. But sometimes things can still sting. So moving on to the next slide, I want to weave in throughout the rest of this presentation a metaphor that was shared with me from a client that I saw. This is somebody that I saw early on in my work as a therapist, a trans man who lost his father while I was working with him. He came in seeking support because his father was dying from cancer and was just looking for some emotional support, some help to process the loss of his dad. And then about 8 weeks into our work together, his dad passed away. And so we got to experience together what it was like to lose this important figure in his life and somebody who became an important figure in my work with this client. I'll be referring to this client by the name Evan. And early on in the work with Evan, he shared with me a beautiful metaphor. He said, losing my dad feels like I'm a two-legged stool. And I asked him what he meant by that. And he said, well, if you have a three-legged stool and you chop one leg off, it's not going to be very stable now, is it? And he said, that's kind of how I feel. I feel like I have one of my legs that's missing and I feel really unstable. And I really need help figuring out how to repair this metaphorical stool. This is something that has really stuck with me in my work with not just grief, but all sorts of things. That whenever we experience a loss or any sort of trauma, small or big, it can feel as though we are a stool that is missing a leg. And throughout this presentation, I'll be talking about what it's like to be missing a leg and how we might be able to repair it so that there can be that stability and that sense of purpose that comes from moving forward with the losses that you've sustained. So, some examples of loss. I mentioned earlier that there's this myth that you can only grieve the death of a loved one. There are lots of other things that we can lose, and therefore lots of other things that we can grieve. In addition to the death of family members or friends, pets are an important thing that we are becoming increasingly aware of in terms of the grief that can follow the loss of a pet. Another main form of loss that I see in my practice is some sort of separation from a loved one, whether that's a breakup or divorce, or even moving away, moving across state lines or moving far away from people that we care about can create strong feelings of grief. Physical or mental illness can also trigger some feelings of grief because our capacity to do certain things is now diminished because of the diagnosis or the symptoms that we may now be carrying with us. Something that we've experienced a lot of over the last while has been missed professional or personal opportunities. If you've ever lost a job, I'm sure that you've experienced some sort of grief response. Sometimes it can be relieving to no longer have to worry about certain professional responsibilities. But there are also times where those professional opportunities gave us a sense of purpose, and now no longer having those can create some pain. There's also losing material things. I mentioned losing keys earlier. That's a really low grade form of grief that might come out of that. But people who experience housing insecurity often lose a lot of their personal belongings as a result. And losing those material objects can create a sense of insecurity that can trigger some feelings of grief. Related to this is also financial insecurity. When we lose a job, or when we take a pay cut, or if somebody who we rely on for financial security is suddenly not sure where the next paycheck is coming from, there can be some worries about the lack of financial stability, and we can mourn the things that we used to have when finances were more stable. A religious or spiritual belief change, sometimes known as a crisis of faith, is yet another example of something that I see often in my work. That when we grow up believing a certain set of things, and then life experience causes us to start questioning those things, to say, oh, maybe I can't trust this higher power, or maybe these religious leaders that I've trusted for so long aren't quite so reliable. That can create this crisis of faith that has a lot of similar features to many of these other kinds of losses. One that I really want to highlight, that I see a lot in my work with this practice, and that I saw with Evan, was struggles around identity change or denial. Evan, as a trans man, really relied on his father as an example for how to be a man. And he really modeled his own masculinity after the example that his father set. And I remember very vividly having a session with him where he said, yeah, dad's gone now, and now I don't have this beacon of hope in my life for my transition, and I don't know what my transition is going to look like from here on out, and I don't really know how to be a man without my dad in the picture. And that was a major component of the loss that he was experiencing. I want to circle also back to some of the financial insecurity stuff. He also was experiencing some financial insecurity as a result of the death of his father. So what that demonstrates is that oftentimes it is not just one form of loss that we're experiencing. We have these secondary losses that create kind of a domino effect that can amplify our experience of grief. So what does that experience of grief look like? Let's dig in a little bit to some of the reactions that people may have to loss. So first is physical. Oftentimes I'll see sleep or appetite changes, whether that's sleeping or eating too little or sleeping or eating too much. Physical weakness or sometimes even physical strength is another thing that I will often see. People will report feeling lethargic, feeling unable to carry out the physical tasks of their day. Tense muscles are another common thing. If we think about a loss as a form of threat, we're going to feel a little bit anxious, and that'll come with tense muscles. Increased illness is also a result of major stressors related to loss. What we know from a lot of medical science that's come out over the last couple decades is that the stress response impacts our immune system, leaving us more susceptible to illness. And so oftentimes I will see when people are experiencing a major loss in their lives that they are more susceptible to the common cold, or even more severe kinds of physical illnesses. Some of the cognitive or thought-based reactions to loss might include difficulty concentrating or making decisions. Focusing, you might find yourself focusing excessively on the loss. You might find dreams or nightmares. That was something that I worked a lot with Evan on. He was having difficulty sleeping specifically because of dreams that he was having. There's low self-esteem, especially if the loss was related to our sense of self-confidence. If, for example, you lose a job, you might have a hit to your self-esteem. If my boss doesn't want me, then maybe I'm not as good of a person or as good of an employee as I thought I was. Then there's hypervigilance. Again, going back to that threat response. Sometimes when we experience certain kinds of losses, we find ourselves keeping an eye out for further losses. Okay, well, I lost this person. Who else am I going to lose? I see this especially with breakups or divorces, where somebody loses an important person in their life and they say, okay, well, this person left me. Now who else is going to leave me? Some common emotions that I see are anger, sometimes at self, sometimes at the person or thing that was lost, or sometimes even anger at people who had nothing to do with the loss. Fear is another common thing. Again, getting back to that hypervigilance. If I have lost this person or lost this thing, am I going to lose something else? Some losses can create feelings of guilt or shame, especially if those losses, again, are connected to that sense of self, that sense of self-confidence. If I lost this person or I lost this thing or I've lost out on these experiences, what does that say about me? Does that say something bad about me? There's also a sense of helplessness, especially if the person, thing, or experience you've lost is a major part of your life, a major part of your safety. You might feel helpless. Okay, I've lost this thing. How can I move on? That can also trigger some feelings of sadness. You might find some increased tearfulness as a result, tying back into that physical reaction. Another common thing that you may not think of as being an emotional response is gratitude. This was a central part of my work with Evan. He expressed a lot of gratitude for the time that he had with his father, and also gratitude for the people who stepped in to take his father's place, emotionally speaking. I remember he shared that many of his father's coworkers reached out to him periodically just to ask, like, hey, do you need anything? Like, if you just need to talk, feel free. Like, here's my number. You can shoot me a text. I remember he shared going out to dinner with these coworkers. These are his dad's coworkers, people he didn't even know all that well. And he shared extensive gratitude because of the kindness that people shared as a result of his loss. Some spiritual reactions to loss might include feeling abandoned by or feeling angry with God, or questioning religious beliefs. On the positive side of things, you might also find yourself experiencing a greater connection with others, or finding a greater sense of purpose in your life. That was something that Evan and I both got out of our work together, was starting to understand that this loss, this death of his father, was a turning point for both of us. I have developed a real passion in working with bereaving individuals, and he has managed to figure out a way to take his own professional skills and interests and weave his own experience of grief into them, so that he can support others using the skill set that he has. So let's talk about some models of grief response. So, stages of grief. You might have seen these on the internet before. This is something that is really commonly well known in talking about grief. Dr. Kubler-Ross was a psychiatrist, I believe, who died probably about 20 years ago. And she worked with people who were experiencing the grief related to their own death. These were people who were dealing with terminal illness and who were grappling with what it meant to be on their deathbeds. So she identified 5 stages. So first is denial, which makes sense. You know, when we have a surprise loss come out of the blue, it can be tough to adjust to that new world. And we may say, oh, I can't believe it. Like, I can't believe that this person or this thing or this experience is no longer part of my life. I see this especially with breakups. People have a hard time processing that this person who used to be sleeping right next to them is no longer there. She identified that anger is another stage of grief that many people go through. Again, that anger at self, or anger at others, or anger at the person, thing, or experience that was lost. Then comes this bargaining. So the way that you can think of this in terms of terminal illness is, okay, I'm really sick. What can I do to prevent myself from dying? Is there anything that I can do to recover this loss, whether anticipated or actual? Then there's depression. After it really starts to set in, okay, there's nothing I can do. I've done all the bargaining I can, and I am going to lose this, or I have lost this person, thing, or experience. Then there's a low point, some sadness, some numbness. And then we start to move into a period of acceptance as we learn how to recover some of in some way, the things that we've lost. Then we can begin to accept, okay, this is okay. I lost this person, I lost this thing, I no longer have access to this experience, but everything's going to be okay. So in my own clinical practice, I don't love talking about the stages of grief because it touches on some of those myths that we covered earlier. This idea that grief should have an endpoint, or that if you are experiencing these stages out of order, that there's something wrong with you. Dr. Kubler-Ross actually didn't ever intend for this to be a linear process, but because that's so embedded in the way that we think about the stages of grief, I often present to my clients a different way to think about grief, and that comes from the Strube and Schutt dual process model. So that sounds really scary, but let me break it down for you. So instead of looking at grief in terms of phases or in terms of goals. They said, what do people actually do in managing grief throughout their lives, regardless of what it looks like, whether there's anger or whether there's bargaining or depression? What are they actually doing at every single stage? What are they doing a year, 2 years, 5 years, 20 years after the loss? And what they found is that people tend to lean one direction or the other in terms of their management of the grief response. So first is the loss-oriented approach to grief, which is spending time acknowledging the fact that there is something that is missing. When I'm talking with clients about a death, that can be planning a funeral, that can be sitting and reflecting on the person that you've lost, that can be even, I'm thinking about something with Evan, that Evan's dad had an office that remained untouched for actually the entirety of my time working with him. The family never went into dad's office. And so that can be a loss-oriented strategy, is to say, okay, this office, this space that was theirs, I'm going to leave it as it is. And while I'm trying to process the thing that I've lost. Now, a restoration oriented approach is beginning to figure out how to restore that which was lost. Obviously, there are many losses that we cannot fully restore. We cannot bring back the dead. We sometimes can't go back and get the job that we lost. We can't call up our ex and ask them to come back. And so what we have to do is we have to figure out how to fill the hole that is left behind by the person, thing, or experience that we've lost. And that's where the restoration-oriented approach kicks in, right? So we have, I guess one example. I'll change directions here. With the restoration-oriented approach, one way that can look is by cleaning out that office, or by going out and developing new hobbies. We'll be talking about some of the restoration-oriented stuff here later on in the presentation, but it looks like taking a look at the hole that is left behind by that thing that you've missed and trying to figure out how to fill it in some way that can keep you going and keep you moving forward in life. Grief is not about moving on. It's about moving forward with the loss. There are things that we lose that create a pain that never quite goes away. And all we do is we figure out how to integrate that loss into our everyday lives, because the thing, the person, the experience that we've lost is still part of us in some way. One thing that I often will share with my clients and brainstorm with them is, what are the things that you learned from this person or this experience that you no longer have, and how is it still there with you? I want to cover some cultural differences in the grieving process. So I have left things pretty open-ended to try to say, okay, different people will experience grief in different ways. And no matter how you grieve, that's okay. That's still true. I want to highlight some of the ways in which maybe our experience here in the States is different from ways that people from other countries or from other non-Western cultures might experience grief and mourning. So the first thing is quiet or private grief versus loud and public grief. This was very much at play in my work with Evan. He shared with me that at the funeral that it was more like a party. And he said that it was really hard for him because everybody was loud and If there was crying, it was, you know, like stumbling out in the street, like letting passersby know that this loss had happened. And he experienced grief in a much quieter way. And he said, I prefer to grieve on my own. And there were even some aspects of his grief that he didn't feel comfortable sharing with me, because he said, this is something that I feel that I have to carry on my own. So regardless of whether you grieve quietly or loudly or privately or in front of other people, it's okay. You do what you need to do. Typically here in the States, we do opt for that quiet or private grief. And so there can be some shame in louder expressions of grief. But I'm here to tell you that if that's what you need to do, that's okay. There's also some gender or age-based differences across cultures that, for example, here in the States, we tend to say that children don't really experience grief. We know that that's not true. They just experience it in a different way than adults. But there is a little bit of a stigma against supporting children in their grief here in the States, whereas other countries and other non-Western cultures make far more room for people of younger ages to express and experience their grief. There can also be some gender-based dynamics as well. This was not something that was really at play with Evan, but I have definitely seen it come into play where certain genders are allowed more room for grief depending on the thing that they've lost, according to their cultural background. There's also a lot of differences in rituals. So when I originally made this slide, I broke down rituals into all of these different parts. I'll just keep it simple and say that some pre-death rituals, as the person is on their deathbed, might vary from culture to culture, as will the post-death ways of doing things, both immediately after with a funeral or wake, and then also honoring anniversaries afterward. How long people are expected to grieve is also something that is highly impacted by one's cultural background. Here in the States, we say keep it as short as possible. We don't want to see it. Again, keep it quiet and private. If you're going to be sad, don't. Nora, the woman who shared that video, or who I shared that video with, she used a beautiful phrase where she said, "Don't get your sad on me." And I think that that is a common thing that we often hear, that we shouldn't be sharing our sadness with other people. So the shorter you can make that grief, the better. There are other cultures, though, where it is far more acceptable to be grieving for a long time. And if your grief is on the shorter side of things, sometimes people can respond by saying that there's something wrong with you then. So there's the ongoing commemoration of the loss, which again ties into that ritual. So with anniversaries or with maintaining a grave, there are all of these different things that we do to recognize the things that we've lost. I'm aware of the fact that I'm talking about most of these in terms of death because that's where my expertise lies. But other kinds of losses also create different dynamics culturally. One big cultural difference that I found to be really fascinating in my work with Evan was with the new roles that he had to take on. Typically from a lot, so I was originally raised in the Midwest, and it was very common that if there was a death, that you just kind of had that hole, and okay, you know, dad's gone, and we just try to do the best that we can to operate without this person. But what Evan experienced as a Latino male was that his family expected him to kind of take his dad's place, emotionally and somewhat financially as well. That was something that was just an additional pressure for him to work through. And so that is something that is also something to be aware of, especially with death, that when there is somebody who's gone, you may find yourself shifting into a new role within your family or within your biological family or your chosen family. So we've talked a lot about what grief is. We've talked a lot about that two-legged stool, right? The leg is missing. Now let's talk about what it looks like to repair the stool somewhat. So first, I want to kick off with self-care, or what I like to call restorative practices. I find that self-care is a term that we have overused. It is something that is just kind of this buzzword in clickbait articles that has lost a lot of its meaning. And so in my work with my clients, I will instead talk about restorative practices, going back to that dual process model that I spoke about earlier. This idea that we should be engaging in restoration-oriented activities. So there are a handful of things that you can do by yourself to help manage feelings of grief and loss. So first is to maintain your physical health. Remember how I mentioned that stress makes us sick? Well, if you've experienced a loss, then you're going to want to take care of yourself physically. Make sure that you're going to bed and waking up at reasonable hours. Make sure that you are eating right, getting good exercise, and go to the doctor if you find yourself having some physical symptoms that seem out of the ordinary. Create and stick to a routine. This is especially important for people who lose loved ones. That without that person in our lives, we find ourselves sinking into a really strong, almost like a black hole of despair. And so it's important to create and stick to a routine so that you can regulate your internal bodily experience to maintain that physical health. It's also important to find hobbies or creative activities that you can engage in. This goes right along with creating a routine. Find things that you enjoy. You don't need to be sad all the time. It's okay to take time away from the loss to enjoy yourself. My huge thing is movies. I love watching movies. And I remember after a significant loss that I sustained, it was tough for me to slow down and say, you know what? It's okay to take an evening to just watch a fun movie. It's okay to engage in hobbies or to find new creative things to preoccupy yourself with. Another thing you can do is to identify mementos. In a video blog that was recently published, I shared that when you're experiencing feelings of grief at the workplace, it can be helpful to place a picture of a loved one or some sort of reminder of the person, thing, or experience that you've lost on the desk so that you can have that to help you to feel more connected to that thing that you've lost. Another thing, especially around anniversaries, is to be aware of triggers. I'm thinking again about Evan and some of the triggers for him. There were certain places that he felt that he couldn't go shortly after the loss because it just brought too many strong memories, and it was really hard for him to be going to his dad's favorite restaurant, for example, without it triggering a really strong emotional response. So if you've lost something and you have a sense that there is something that may cause you to spiral a bit, feel free to put some distance between you and whatever that reminder might be. Over time, what we find is that those triggers tend to become less intense, but in the immediate wake of a loss, feel free to set some boundaries to say, okay, I know this is going to really bring up some strong emotions for me, and I can't cope with that right now. So I'm going to not go there, or I'm going to not do this thing. to avoid those strong emotions. In addition to self-care, community care is something that I find to be also really important. You don't have to grieve alone. If you find that you need that space to grieve alone, absolutely do that. And also recognize that there are some community resources out there that can support you. So, first, I recommend reaching out to family or friends or other people who have been impacted by the same loss. That can be friends who also knew the person that you lost, or who have also experienced job insecurity. Um, it can be really anyone. There are people out there who can provide the empathy that can help you to feel stronger in the wake of a loss. Another thing is a grief support group. There are hundreds and hundreds of grief support groups online and in person that you can attend, some of which have very specific niches. For example, with the Hot Young Widows Club that I alluded to earlier, that's specifically for people who have lost a romantic partner. But there are groups out there for pet loss. There are people out there running groups for job insecurity or housing insecurity related things. Um, there's a grief group for everything. Here at the practice, we're hopefully going to be starting a grief group here in the fall. I'll be sharing a little bit more about that towards the end of the presentation. So another source is a religious congregation. If you find yourself with a religious background and you feel that that could be a source of strength for you, then reaching out to your religious leaders or other members of your congregation can be a really great way to shore up some of the emotional resources that you need to get through a loss. And then, of course, I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't plugging therapy, right? Sometimes therapy can be really helpful. And in fact, I'm going to hop to the next slide and talk about when you probably should seek therapy. I generally would say it's good for any sort of loss, but especially if you are experiencing certain reactions to a loss, I encourage you to reach out to somebody for additional support. So if you find that it's difficult to engage in your usual tasks, then it's helpful to seek out therapy to get additional support for getting you back on track. So after a major loss, you're going to have some inability. This is not to say that, oh, if you have to take a day off work that, oh, you should be in therapy. That's not what I'm saying at all. Rather, what I'm saying is that if this is happening for an extended period of time that you are not really able to do much of anything, then I encourage you to seek help. The general rule of thumb that I offer to my clients is 72 hours. If it's been 72 hours since you've done anything that feels good, whether that is getting out of bed or showering or watching a movie, again, I like movies. If you haven't done anything that feels good for 72 hours, then that's a sign that you should probably seek additional support. If you're finding that you're having panic attacks or that it's triggering addictive behaviors, that would be addictions to drugs or alcohol, or addiction to gambling or pornography, any of these things that you find yourself unable to quit, that might be a sign that some additional support would be helpful. If you're finding intrusive thoughts, if you're finding it difficult to think about anything other than that which you've lost, then it's probably a good idea to have some additional support to help dig into some of those intrusive thoughts and to find strategies for expanding your attention to other areas of life. And then, of course, if you find that the loss that you've experienced is triggering some suicidal feelings, if you're wondering if life is worth living after this loss, then absolutely reach out to a mental health professional for support. So I want to close the main part of the presentation by talking a little bit about mindfulness and self-compassion. That was, I would say, the biggest thing that I learned from my work with Evan. He, in our last session, looked me right in the face and he said, "You know what? I am going to survive this." And that has really stuck with me in my own losses, in helping clients with their losses, that regardless of what happens, you will survive the loss. One of our other psychotherapists at the practice, Zachary Modell, has put together a fantastic video talking about self-compassion and mindfulness practices. And I've lifted a short clip where he describes what that can look like that I want to share with you.
I'd like to leave you with a takeaway practice today. Each day for a week, try scheduling 3 to 5 minutes 2 times per day for a compassion practice. That's 3 to 5 minutes 2 times per day for 7 days, and see what you notice. The foundation of the practice is simply spending those few minutes offering compassion. In other words, with the wish for yourself and others to be free from suffering. Explore what that means for you. For example, many of us have a tendency to be highly critical of ourselves or others, and this can be a source of great suffering. During your practice, you could explore what it feels like to sit for a few minutes, being enough, knowing you're trying your best, putting that demand to be more or to be different on hold for just a few minutes, or offering that to others. Another example, you could spend those minutes simply asking that you and others be free from suffering, much like a prayer. Do some experimenting. However you end up using those minutes, what's important is your intention. Sometimes it's literally like flipping a switch. And one more detail. Researcher Stephen Porges has taught us that feeling safer requires more than just an absence of danger. It requires cues of safety. For example, a kind voice or a loving touch, both of which you can try offering to yourself. During your few minutes, you could put your hands on your heart or anywhere else on your body that feels right, with the intention of offering kindness and relieving suffering. In your mind or out loud, if you prefer, you can speak to yourself or others with a kind voice.
I really love the ways in which Zachary talks about mindfulness and self-compassion. A small plug for a group that he runs on a monthly basis. He runs a meditation group that you can sign up for on our website. I think it's a fantastic opportunity to get exposed to some of this way of approaching some of the self-compassion and mindfulness strategies that can help you to feel more grounded. So I'm going to remove the PowerPoint now so that we can have a Q&A session. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, and I will answer them as they come in. So the first question that we have coming up is, my friend recently lost someone. How can I help? This is a fantastic question because a lot of what I focused on in this presentation is how to handle your own grief. But what if you have somebody that you care about who has lost a loved one or who has lost something important in their life? How can you support them in their struggles? There are a ton of things that I can say. I could have a whole presentation just on this, but the most important thing that I would say, especially if it is a death of somebody who is close to them, is to just find ways to support them in terms of physical needs. So whether that is helping them make sure that they have meals set up, or helping them with make sure that funeral arrangements have been made. The thing that I would say about this is that it is probably best to just jump in and find a way to help rather than asking if somebody needs help. Because what we often see with people who are grieving is that they're feeling a little bit of that numbness that I alluded to earlier, and they may not be in a headspace where they can direct you to exactly what they need because they may not know themselves. And so just pay attention to what they're doing and try to see if there's something missing that you yourself can add in. Another question is a well-known person recently died and it's all over the news. Why do I feel so sad about it? This is something that in our social media age is really common, right? Where we have a celebrity or a well-known political figure who passes away, and we may be finding ourselves having a bit of a grief response. It seems a little bit strange because they weren't necessarily a central part of our lives. They weren't somebody that we saw in the coffee shop or had dinner with or got to know really well, but it can still bring up some really strong feelings. I would say the reason why you feel so sad about it is because they were a fixture in your life, maybe in a more symbolic way, especially in the case of well-known actors. You probably grew up watching their movies or their TV shows, and they helped you to feel joy or feel sadness or feel excitement or anger, and you had a strong emotional response to the work that they were doing, and now they are no longer doing that work, and that can create a sense of loss. Another question that we have is, should a child go to a funeral? If so, how do I prepare them for it? This is another question that I get frequently, particularly with clients who are parents of young kids. If there's a death in the family, how do you help the kid process it? Oftentimes we assume that kids are not grieving, but they are, and they're grieving in their own way. When it comes to a funeral, I would say that it is up to you and your child whether or not you would like them to go to the funeral. Leave it up to them. If they would like to go, if they are of an age where they can be, making that decision and deciding, maybe I don't want to go, then allow them that opportunity. Generally speaking, though, I find that kids are interested in going to funerals to be able to say goodbye to their loved one. So it's really important when you are preparing them to attend the funeral that you walk them through what the process is going to look like. To say, yeah, like people are going to be dressed up real nice, and this is what the room is going to look like where we're going to hold the funeral. And this family member, this is where they're going to be, and they're going to be in a box, and it's going to look like they're sleeping. Walk them through what the graveside service might look like. I'm of course assuming that that a graveside service will be needed. There are obviously other ways to memorialize a person who has passed on. So one thing that I'm noticing in the chat is that somebody is asking for examples of how kids go through the grieving process. What I often see with kids is that it is not a gradual process the way that it is with adults. What we often see with adults is that there may be that initial shock, and then things will get worse, and then they'll get better. What I see with kids is that oftentimes they don't fully understand what it is like to no longer have this person or this thing in their lives. And so they are not necessarily experiencing denial, but you may not see a very strong response at first. That strong response may come and go. And so rather than it being this very smooth arc that we often will see with adults, it will be almost like a a jerking of a car as you're, hitting on the brakes, right? It's going and then it's stopping. It's going and then it's stopping. Um, Another question that's baked into the comment in the chat is how we can identify if therapy is needed for children. So I don't have a ton of experience on this. I would be happy if you shoot me an email. I'll provide my email address later. I'd be happy to give a more in-depth response to this question. But I would say that if you notice the child is starting to do what we would consider to be abnormal things, things like self-harm, or if you find that they are being very difficult in school over a long period of time, if you find that they are sobbing for extended periods of time, then there may be something more to explore there. At the very least, you can schedule a consultation with a therapist who can gauge whether your specific child's needs would warrant additional support from a professional. So we have a couple other questions that have come up. Actually, a lot more than a couple. My goodness, we have plenty of questions. So the first question that I'm seeing on this list is, can grieving a loss of a parent lead to a breakup? Absolutely. I recently was on a podcast talking about grief within the polyamory community. And what I have found amongst polyamorous individuals is that when there is some sort of loss, that there is a tendency to push away romantic partners, because polyamorous people are very reliant on those relationships for their sense of strength. And so in the uncertainty that follows a loss, sure, there can be some breakups that might happen. A question related to self-care has come in. This person says, I tried creating hobbies, taking care of my physical health. I went to therapy, and I've done many other small activities such as yoga and meditation. But after a year of being very careful to my state of mind and well-being, everything came crumbling down. I felt very disappointed that my outlets were not working anymore. Her question is, what tools would be useful to start moving up the stairs again? That is a great question. One that I don't know if I totally have an answer to, given that I don't know the nature of your loss. But what I would say is pay attention to the moments where you notice that the crumbling is happening, where you notice that things are really challenging, and pay attention specifically to your body. What is your body telling you that you need in that moment? Are you feeling tired? That might suggest that your sleep might need some adjusting. Do you feel lonely? Maybe reaching out to a friend could help. In fact, even as I say that, I think that might be a good place to start. I noticed that in the list that you provided of things that you've done, a lot of these are the self-care kinds of things. I wonder what it would look like to turn to your community, to turn to family or friends, or to a grief group for additional support, to get further ideas that might help you to get out of the rut that you might be in. Another question that has come in, what do I say in response to others who tell me it takes time or something similar? I'm just taking a second to take in that question. I'm assuming that what's built into that question is maybe you might be feeling some impatience with the grief process. And so somebody is saying like, oh, it takes time to get through your loss. And you're wondering like, okay, like, but it's been this amount of time. Like, how do I respond to people who are telling me not to rush the process? What I would say is you're not rushing the process. You are going at the pace that you should be. So if it takes time, it takes time. If it's a very short grieving process, then it's a very short grieving process. Your body will tell you what it needs when it needs it. There's another question asking if I would encourage clients to make amends with their loved ones if they know it's a matter of time before they pass away. For example, let's say someone hasn't talked to their mom in years because of the toxic nature of their relationship, but mom is now very sick. Would you encourage the client to try to reach out to their mother before it's too late, even if it would increase the client's anxiety levels? Would that help with the grieving process? I'm going to say I don't know. And that is not an I don't know because I don't necessarily have the answer. It's more of an I don't know because it depends. There are some people who find that as they look forward to a world in which that person is no longer in their life, that there are things that they want to say. And so, sure, maybe if you feel comfortable, if you feel comfortable going to see that loved one, if you feel comfortable going to see that loved one, then sure, like but I would encourage you to work that out with your therapist to see, okay, like just how uncomfortable is it? Is it something that is going to cause you to spiral out of control? Then maybe don't go see mom. But if it's something that you could see yourself regretting after the fact, like, oh, there were things that I needed to say to mom that I couldn't, then you might want to consider visiting with mom. But again, chat with your therapist about that. Work with them to identify where that cutoff is for what you can tolerate. Another thing that I'll throw in there is that even if you choose not to see mom, you can instead, okay, so let's say you choose not to see mom. If mom has passed, or if you're worried about those feelings of regret, you can put your thoughts into a letter. I did this with Evan, where I had him write a letter to his father, and then I had him write a letter as if his father was writing back to him. And that was something that helped him to process some of the residual things that he never got to say to his dad. Another question: how do I approach mourning a parent that I had a complicated relationship with? So this ties back to the other question that was asked, right? That is, I think where I'll start is by acknowledging that there is going to be complicated emotions along with that complicated relationship. Remember how I mentioned that some of the emotions that might come up are positive, like even emotions like gratitude. I have worked with people who have lost loved ones that they were kind of grateful that this person was no longer in their lives to hurt them anymore. And so I would approach it from a standpoint of first just recognizing that it is complicated, and then kind of like a ball of yarn, starting to pull on the end of that and seeing what comes out. So, okay, you've got this complication, but what's complicated about it? What are the positives of the relationship, and what are the negatives? Going back to something that I said earlier about sharing or having clients share with me what they have learned through the loss. This can be a great way to tease out some of the complicated relationship stuff. You might have learned some really good things, but you might have also learned some really bad things. If your parent was somebody who is abusive, then you might have learned some really messed up things from them because of that abuse. And so it's important to acknowledge that you learn some good things and you learn some bad things, and it is impossible to separate those two. Somebody asked for some tips for establishing a new routine. I am a huge fan of routine. So the first thing to focus on is sleep. If I have any clients who are listening in on this, they are tired of me talking about sleep. Sleep is the best way to begin structuring a new routine, identifying, okay, here's when I'm going to go to bed and here's when I'm going to wake up. And then within those wakeful hours, starting to establish, okay, what are the things that I need to be doing right now in this moment? What are the things that my body needs throughout the day? What are the things that other people are relying on me for? And then start just plugging it into a calendar. We all have these fancy smartphones with calendar apps these days. And that can be a great place to just say, okay, I know that I'll have this meeting at this time, or I know that I'll have to get groceries at this time. And I know that I have to do this, this, and this. Let me just start throwing it into the calendar. And then what you'll find is that there will be some gaps. And you can use those gaps however you want. If you want to engage in some loss-oriented activities, spending some time just allowing yourself to grieve, that's okay. You can also use that time to find some restoration-oriented activities, pick up a new hobby, bring up old hobbies that maybe you haven't had time for in the past. Make time for that. The next question that has come up is, starts with a narrative. I have been grieving the loss of a 14-year career by my own doing. I have been trying to get back in the field, but keep getting rejected. I seem to be sliding between anger and sadness, but can't move on from there. This is especially the case when I get ghosted after applying for a job or rejected after being selected. I'm assuming that the question that is in there is asking about what to do. It's so you have lost your momentum in a very strong career you've been in for 14 years, and you keep on trying. You're stuck in kind of this anger or sadness phase. As I'm thinking through what that's like, I share in your frustration. It's really tough being able to get back onto that, get that motivation or get that momentum back, especially with the way that our job application process often works. We get ghosted so often. That's really discouraging. First thing I would say is keep on keeping on. You are doing the right thing. I would also encourage you to reach out to certain career resources. There are career coaches out there who might be able to help you be able to get back into that career, because that is something that many career coaches have experience with. We often will suddenly lose a job and we have to figure out how to recover. So I hope that's helpful. If you would like to continue, if you are not finding those thoughts helpful, feel free to shoot me an email and I can try to come up with a more cogent response. The next question is, my own experience is that the Kubler-Ross stages recycle. Is that typical? Absolutely. Again, this is not a steps 1 through 5. Okay, you hit step 5, you are free from your grief. That is not the case at all. What I often will find, and what I have experienced myself, is that I'll have moments of acceptance. There's a really beautiful metaphor that I saw online where somebody described grief as being like a box with a giant bouncing ball in it. And soon after the loss, that ball is really big and it keeps on hitting up against this button that's in the box. And every time it presses the button, you feel this grief response. Over time, that ball gets smaller, but it's still bouncing around. It's still going to hit that button every once in a while. And you might find yourself cycling through those stages again. You might even find yourself going out of order somewhat. The next question: if I'm not experiencing any of the typical grief responses, does it mean that I am not grieving? Sometimes I feel insecure about not caring about things because I don't appear to be grieving in a similar way to the people around me. Yeah, this is something that I've actually spent a lot of time researching more recently on my own, is what happens with these atypical grief responses where the grief is delayed or it's muted. How do we take apart that grief? What I would say is there is no wrong way to grieve. And so if you find that your grief is more muted, if you find um, that it is more private, or even that you're able to generally go about your day without too much impact, that doesn't mean you're not grieving. You are just grieving more in a quiet way. Um, One of the things that was thrown in that question is the insecurity about possibly being perceived as not caring about things, not caring about the loss because you're not grieving in the way that other people are. Again, I think of Evan being the quiet griever that he is. His family thought that he was nuts and thought that he must have hated his dad for not being willing to be wailing in the streets. Um, but the fact of the matter is his own grief process was much more intellectual and was not quite so emotion oriented. That's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with you if that is what your grief response looks like. The next question, do you have any suggestions for people dealing with survivor's guilt after the loss of a loved one? Oh, this is a beautiful question, and something that is getting a lot more attention with some of the public health crises that we've seen recently. There is a lot to be said for people um, who are continuing on after somebody's life has ended. Um, as for suggestions, I would strongly encourage you to seek out your own therapy, because what I'm about to say is not going to sink in after just one repetition. I would say that it's okay. It wasn't your fault. Regardless of how the loss came about, even if it's a traumatic loss like a suicide, it wasn't your fault. That person is gone because of things outside of your control. Again, I know that that is not going to sit well right off the bat. And I encourage you, if you are experiencing survivor's guilt, to seek out support from a trained professional who can help you to explore that guilt and find ways to alleviate it. So the last question that we have for the evening um, is it possible for a grieving person who broke up with you because of the grief to come back? He said he can't be in a relationship right now because of it. So based on another comment on here, it sounds like this is a follow-up question to that question about whether or not a breakup is common with grief. I would say that it is possible that the grieving person who broke up with you could come back. It is possible that as they go through their own grieving process, that they say, okay, I've done the work that I need to do. And I think I'm ready to, and I feel comfortable being in a relationship with you again. That may not necessarily be the case. I would not bank on it, but I would also not close yourself off to it either. It is very possible that they could come back, and it's also possible that they will move on to a new stage of their life as a result of the loss. So that's all we have for questions. If you have any other questions that you would like to send me, I'm going to throw my email address up here on the screen. So some closing remarks. Again, as I said at the start, I work for this practice, My Therapy NYC. We are based in the Flatiron district of New York City. We offer individual therapy and group therapy for a variety of things, not just grief. Grief is my specialty. If you find that you would like additional support with grief, feel free to reach out to me and we can work something out. I'm also going to be starting a grief group here in the fall. And so in your chat box, you're going to see, in your chat box, you're going to see a link um, to a questionnaire about grief, about a grief group. My apologies. Um, and so you can go to that link to just share your interest in the possibility of a grief group if that's something that you are open to. Um, if you would like to learn more about the services that we offer, you can go to mytherapynyc.com, or you can follow us on all major social media platforms at mytherapynyc. We have Instagram, Facebook. I think we're even on LinkedIn, if that's your thing. And again, my email address is right there on the screen, taylor@mytherapynyc.com. Feel free to shoot any questions or comments to my email address, and I'll get to them when I'm able. Thank you so much for attending tonight, and have a good evening. We'll be sending out a recording of this webinar and some additional resources in an email in the next couple of weeks, so you can look out for that. And as always, feel free to reach out. Have a good evening.